What's up, Jam Players? Austin Felingo here with JamPlay.com. Welcome to week number 9, I believe. Yep, week number 9 of creating jazz melodies. So, this is going to be a fun one. This is going to kind of veer away a little bit from... The thing is you can use this as a melody, but like with this whole course, right? We're talking about compositional techniques, with jazz being such like an improvisational music, right, or type music. I'm going to kind of show you some cool things, sort of lick-oriented. I mean, they could work as melodies, like I said, but we're going to kind of mess with the thirds and the sevenths, right? So we kind of did that a little bit in some previous lessons here, right? But what I'm going to show you is like kind of the power and how well they work and also catch the listener's ear, right? So today our contrafact, like I say every lesson, the contrafact is a chord progression, right, with a different melody. Same chord progression, different melody. And today we're going to use, in the style of Sweet Georgia Brown, titled Sweet Georgia Bright, right? So what we're essentially going to do, the chords are fairly simple. They go around in fourths. And we're going to take third and seventh kind of licks and kind of keep walking them down. So it's gonna give for a really nice motif, like we've been covering a lot, using the third and sevenths, like I said, and kind of how they flip flop. Yeah, it's gonna be like like I said, a cool motif, if you will. So the listener knows what you're doing, but also could kind of act like a melody as well. So real quick, just a little history here. Sweet Georgia Brown, written in 1925 by Ben Burney and Maceo Pinkard, right? If I'm pretty sure everybody knows this tune, but if you don't, it's also the Harlem Globetrotters theme, right? And then also, with this chord progression, like there's a great bluegrass tune called Cincinnati Rag. It's kind of ba-na-na. That's kind of the melody, but that's a really popular one. Another tune that kind of has these progression is like Right or Wrong, right? George Strait made a huge hit out of it. Right or wrong, I always love you. I can't forget, right? So that's another tune. So just to, like I said, get familiar with, understanding these chord progressions. And like I have said in here before, remember, those are huge, like super powerful ear training tools, right? If you can kind of go, oh, well, that sounds like this song or this song. Essentially then, I mean, do the chord changes change in Cincinnati Rag and Right or Wrong differently than Sweet Georgia Brown? Sure, but a lot of it is the same, right? So kind of like, I'm thinking now back on when we did Take the B Train, also known as Take the A Train, right? That tune and like Exactly Like You, which is another popular old standard, very similar tunes with just slight different, bridge alterations. And, when I was, cutting my teeth and, learning all these tunes and, trying to get away from the book, right, and just really use my ears, those kinds of ear training exercises are super powerful, right? Just being like, oh, well, it's like, that's what I used to hear. Somebody would say, well, it's like this tune, but the bridge does this. And then it's like, okay, I got it. Like I said, then you can just build, a bunch of tunes that are, fairly similar. And you just keep learning tunes like that, right? Okay, so like I said, this tune obviously made very famous by the Harlem Globetrotters. We're dealing with a cycle of fourths here. Another thing about the cycle of fourths, right, is this tune we have 4 bars of E7, 4 bars of A7, 4 bars of D7, 4 bars of G, right, a G6. Or I'm sorry, we're actually in F, so it's really 4 bars of D7, 4 bars. It can sometimes be played in G, that's why I said that. My bad. But 4 bars of D7, 4 bars of G7, 4 bars of C7, 4 bars of F6. Right? But also a great way to practice licks because you have so much room there to, run the lick twice and then move to the next chord, right? And what I've also said too, we haven't covered this a whole lot because we're talking more about like melodies and, harmonic devices and rhythmic devices to kind of come up with cool melodies. But with the lick too, just by like altering a note or something, if the chord, its DNA changes, whether it's like a natural 9 or a flat 9 or something, just by kind of having that knowledge and taking a lick and then just switching that note to make it fit over the chord is a super powerful tool, right? Okay, so form-wise, right, it's kind of like a Sweet Georgia Bright is kind of like I guess it's more of like an A-B, right? And very similar. The only thing is like the second time part of the B changes, right? Here, let's see. Let me look at my notes. So we're in the key of F, like I mentioned. We're starting on a 6 chord. We'll listen to it, and then I'll talk about some other stuff here in a second. But yeah, 180 beats a minute, really like 90. It might sound sort of fast, but if you could just kind of keep the pulse, going at half the speed, it's not too bad. And like I said, to get this under our fingers, it's not going to be like blazing or anything. So yeah, let's go ahead and give it a listen. Also, a little note about the track here, right? We have drums, upright bass, rhythm guitar, and just like a kind of standard New Orleans, almost kind of gypsy jazz in a way, acoustic rhythm, and then we have an electric on top, right? Just like last week, I left this tune halfway open, so you can literally just practice what we've been doing over it or try to solo and stuff. We're not going to really do a whole lot of soloing stuff today, but you literally have a whole part of the tune and then it repeats again, and then with a tag on the end where it just walks down the last few bars. So here, let's give it a listen and then we'll talk about what we're getting into here. First kind of motif, right? Thirds and sevenths. Here we go again. Back to the repeat. Okay, so there's our tune. I'll play it so you can see how I put it under my fingers and everything, and then we'll do some chords and arpeggios, and we'll get into the meat of this thing. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and check it out. All right. Now you're going to notice a couple other things I did for fun in here. I also did a quote, kind of like an Inspector Gadget. Not exactly, but that first part, right? And then here. Quotes are cool, right? Around Nashville we use quotes all the time, like, whether it's that or any of those kinds of things. I put that in there because it's fun, it's recognizable, right? And the list, everybody knows that, right? So not a bad idea. Just kind of a fun little aspect there. Okay. So let's talk about a few things before we really get into it. So this tune, obviously, if you've ever been in New Orleans, it gets played a lot there. This isn't in here, but I'm going to show you this before the chords, right? So what's cool about this tune, and a lot of times it gets started like this. This is why we're talking about it. But it's what you call a second line, right? And that's like a New Orleans thing, it's a groove, and it comes from like the 3/2 clave. So bop, 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 a bop, bop. So if you can imagine the drummer, we've all heard this. Bop, And then the rhythm, you know, right, and with the melody, it would be, you know, bum, 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 bum. It's kind of hard to sing and play. Right, we've all heard that, right? So that is a cool thing that you can do with this. And like I always talk about, right, creating jazz melodies, arrangements, harmonic devices, rhythmic techniques, right? That's what we're talking about here. This is a great way to break it up. And this is also like if you wanted to do the second line thing, you generally want to do it kind of in the beginning, right? Because it sets it up. The melody's going, it's like this cool groove underneath it. And then you can just get into the straight swing of things. But like I said, I couldn't help but not put that in there because I play it like that all the time. I didn't want it to be like monotonous in the track, so I just chose to do swing. But I'll play it real quick with the chords, and then we can kind of go over that. Right, so we have 1, 2, 3. Works great. Right? Then you can just start swinging. Right? Then kind of a double time swing, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's kind of the idea behind the second line, right? It's the 3-2 clave and, you know, a lot of accents on the snare. It makes it sound, I mean, very New Orleans, right? I mean, that's kind of the recognizable thing, but it kind of comes from that Latin 3-2 clave kind of thing. So that's another aspect, like I said, to put in your arsenal instead of just straight swing all the time, right? Okay, so we have a chart here, right? We have chords. Now remember, today I'm just going to kind of use the basic chords that we've been using. Like, you know, you can use any of the ones that we've been going over, the different grips, right? But today, so we have 4 bars of D7, right? So we have... Here, let me pull it up here. And these are my choices, right? They work great all the time. So we have D7 like that, coming from the C form. But this is your standard D7, right? So we have 4 bars of that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then your G7, right? So here's the thing with this, right? The guide finger, like I always talk about. You could do that. Remember, you can use any of these grips. You have choices. You can even do this one. Right? The 5th, the 3rd, the 7th, or the 3rd, and then the flat 7. Which is another one we used. Another one we use, like when you go to G7 up here, is great too. I'm just kind of choosing this area of the neck. It sounds great, super clean. There's no colors in it. It's just roots, 3rds, 7ths. You know, roots, 3rds, 5ths, and 7ths, right? So there's your D7, right? And then with my guide finger, with my pinky on that 3rd string, I slide back. And remember, those always work great at, you know, super speeds and stuff, right? You know, that finger never leaves that string, so it's easy to grab your next chord, right? So we have D7, 4 bars of that, G7, 4 bars of that. Now C7, just like D7, but up, but down 2 frets. Right, and now our F6, which we've used in here before. Right, everything's marked correctly on your sheet there. Right, but it's an F6 with a 5th in the bass. So we have the 5th, which is the C, 2nd finger, 3rd fret, 5th string. Then we have a root, 3rd finger, 3rd fret, 4th string. Then we have our 3rd with the 1st finger, 2nd fret, 3rd string, right, the A note. And then we have the 6th, which is the D note with your pinky on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. right? So all together we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, G2, 3, 4, G2, 3, 4, G2, 3, 4, C2, 3, 4. Now F2, 3, 4. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Before we go to the second half, check this out, right? We're going back to a D7. So there's several ways to do this. What I chose to do is I have a split bar between F and an A seventh chord, right? But I chose to go the chromatic route, meaning I went from C, which is the F with the fifth in the bass, to the C sharp, which is the third in the bass of the A7. And look at that. That looks familiar, right? What was that, last week or the week before? I think actually both weeks we used that chord. Right, so remember, this looks like a C sharp half diminished, right? But I don't use this note because this also equals C sharp half diminished, you know, or a just like right here, or an A9, right? But I'm not playing that note because as a soloist, if they want to use a flat 9 on that chord, my note doesn't rub in the way with that half step between a 9 and a flat 9, right? So that, like I said, it's all numbered there, but it's that grip, right? First finger, 4th fret, 5th string. That's the third, the C sharp of the A7th chord. Flat 7 on the 5th fret, 3rd finger, 4th string, right? The G note, and then you omit, you know, like a lot of these chords where we choke a string. You choke your 3rd string, and then you have your 5th on the 5th fret of the 2nd string, pinky finger, right? And what that does is that's a 5-to-1 relationship in the D7, right? A7 is 5 of D, right? So it sets it up, you know, for the listener to know that we're going back to that chord, right? So you have D7 again, G7. Here's where we change. Now we go D minor. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just using a straight D minor there. Right? To A7 using the guide finger. See how it slides back there? 1, 2, 3, 4. A7, 2, 3, 4. Right? Just like G7, just up 2 frets. 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we have an F6 like this. So you got your pinky on the root, 8th fret, 5th string, and then we have our 3rd on the 7th fret of the 4th string with your 3rd finger, or I'm sorry, your 2nd finger, and then your 3rd finger goes on the D or the 6 again, right? So here's one inversion, here's our other. So the 6 on the 7th fret of the 3rd string with 3rd finger, and then our root grabs on the 6th fret, 2nd string with the 1st finger. Right? And then what this does, this is kind of fun, it's just a chromatic walk down all the way down to 5 before we go home to 1. Right? So we have, and it's a split bar, we have F6, 1, 2, then E7. Right? So that kind of works nicely. And remember, if you're ever having trouble with these chords, great way to practice is keep an instrument next to you. So if you're watching TV or something and the commercial comes on, like I always like to say, grab your guitar and practice this, just going like that. You do that a few minutes between each commercial break, before you know it, you'll be cooking with those chords, right? So we got F6, E7, and then chromatic to E flat, D7, D flat, C7, and then back to our F6 like that. So that's our whole chord progression, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, D7, right? 4 bars of D7, 4 bars of G7, 4 bars of C7. F6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Get ready for the split bar. F, A7 with a 3rd in the bass. Back to D7. G7 again. Get ready for a D minor, right? The change at the end. D minor, 2, 3, 4, A7, 2, 3, 4. D minor, 2, 3, 4, A7, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, F6, E7, E flat, D flat, C, F. And then 2, 3, D7, and then the tune starts over. And like I mentioned, you have a whole nother thing in the track, a whole nother pass to practice with, right? So that kind of covers our chords. Okay, so now let's kind of go over how I'm seeing the arpeggios. So, like I said, just like I think last week or the week before as well, I know I'm like a broken record, but it's important, right? You got to drill these things in your head. So my melody goes... Now G7, C7, slide down, right? Okay, so you're probably thinking, well, Austin, you're playing chords down there. I don't see where that's coming from, right? That is why your arpeggios are so important, right? Always, try to connect the dots with that. So here's what I'm doing, right? First off, I meant to say this earlier, but I'm playing low on the guitar, right? I like to play low, the low notes on it doesn't get used as much, right? Everybody's always busy soloing on the top 3 strings, and that's great. It gets heard, but like the low vibe is cool too, right? That's cool, right? But I like that low vibe, and that's what we're going to check out here. And we're also doing it because I feel like people overlook it, right? So we're not going to overlook it. We're going to look at it. So here's how I'm looking at this, right? I'm doing the C form D7, right? Now, obviously, we don't have time in here to talk about all this, but Cage system is great. Like with every one of these chords, you should try to find the lowest and move up to the highest. So if we're talking about D7, what's our lowest D7? Well, right here, right? Then we have that, right, which is the C form. So this comes from the D form. D, C, remember it always goes in a pattern. Then you have A, G, E form, and D form, right? We're not going to go over that too much today. That's something to do on your own, but the more that you can do that up and down, up an octave and back, you're golden. It just totally helps you see the fretboard, right? So what I'm doing is I'm kind of approaching it from the G form, sort of like, I sort of look at it like that in between the A form, even though we're playing the chords here. And here's the reason why. You might also be thinking, well, why aren't you playing a D7 like this? Remember when we talked about how, like, even though chords are the same, like the inversions can sound different? That's why. Like certain styles like certain voicings, right? If I'm going, right, that would be like your basic sort of sevenths that we learn at first. Is it wrong? No. But does it kind of sound dorky? Yes. See how much cleaner and like it's meatier? It's like a little bit more mid-range. It's a stylistic thing, right? So, like I said, via Caged, it's important. You really should be able to see all these different forms, just from straight D to D sevenths. But, that's kind of how I'm looking at it, right? There's your A form, there's your G form. So arpeggio-wise, this is the third of the, right, third to fifth. That's the third of the D7, right? So we have this. So here's how the arpeggio is. And like I said earlier, I know we covered this, where I said, all right, I'm going to play chords one way because they sound sonically better. And then melody-wise, I'm looking at a different arpeggio, right? But most importantly, just look at the arpeggios because this won't just be some random lick that Austin showed you, right? And that's very important here. So I'm looking at it from there. Now, remember, too, when we covered pentatonic melodies and stuff, one of the first scales as guitar players we all learn, especially from the minor perspective, the relative minor of D being B minor, right? But if you start on your pinky of D, and it's a major pentatonic. So that's kind of where it's coming from, right? And once you see that, it's like, oh, I know exactly what he's saying. It's just right here. Not that. Right? So that's where it's coming from, right? So, and we'll get into the melody in a second. Now we have our D, or our G7th, right? So this is a little trickier, and anybody wants to ask me a question about this, we did cover this a few weeks ago, but I'm kind of looking at this from like one of the 16 inversions of a 7th chord, right? So I think the easiest way to kind of look at this, right, is if we're right here with our D, well, where's our next available C, or G, because we're going to G? Well, it's right here, right? Right, so our D arpeggio, sorry, I forgot that we have... Right, 7th position. Right? Coming, you know, it's chromatic in a way, but, you know, it's not straight pentatonic, obviously, but that's where we're seeing that, right? So from G7, there's your G7th, right? Or there's your G, here's your G7th. Right? Now, here's the thing. This comes from the 16 inversions, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Kind of a new chord, but that's a G7th, right? It's the 7th in the root. There's your 3rd. There's your 5th. There's your root. Right? And like I said, the whole point of this is flip-flopping these 3rds and 7ths. Now, let's talk about that for a second. The thing is there's something, it's like a phenomenon in harmony, right, in music. And when these chords are cycling in fourths, right, D is going to G, G is going to C, D, E, F sharp, G, that's 4, right? G, A, B, C, right, that's a 4th. What happens is the notes wind up being right next to each other, or chromatic, or a half step off, right? So what I'm doing is I'm literally taking like a lick, right, and just having the knowledge of where all my 3rds and 7ths are within these chords. And it might be a little fuzzy, you know, because we are in a lower area of the neck, which we don't look at. That's why we're doing that, though, because it is a super cool and hip area to make music in. You move down one, and that's the flat 7 of the G chord, right? So it's kind of coming from that, it's kind of coming from this, right? And here's the thing, like, this takes some practice. It absolutely does. But I would really encourage you, like, to think about those numbers. And, like, when I, like, what was a really, really powerful tool, and I've said this in here before, but, like, my teacher, when I was learning jazz licks and stuff, I was like, well, what is, you know, this? And he goes, well, you learn this, and then if you learn how chords work, and like I mentioned earlier, like, if, say, you switch to the chord, and maybe it just needs a note difference, right? Like a major 7 to a dominant 7, so that half step, right? You know, major 7, flat 7, right? Whole step from the root to a half. If you change that when it becomes a dominant chord, you can use the exact same lick, and it sounds perfect because you're using the right note, which is the flat 7. So that's kind of like, it's doing a little bit of math in a way, and it does take a little bit of getting used to, but it's super, super useful, right? So G7, so what I did was, so if we go over the first lick, what I'm doing is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and, right? So there's our arpeggio sliding in from the flat 3rd on the beat 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. 3rd of the D7, right? Like I said, if the bridge here is from the A form to the G form. 3rd, 5th, 3rd. And once you get it down, and you know, it's and I'm making, and you're gonna notice on your on the sheet here, I have the notes dotted as short, right? That's kind of it just makes it sound hipper, right? You know, just kind of plucking with your pick, you know, nice short right hand technique. Boom, 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 boom. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and, right? So now D7, here's G. I know if I go down a whole step, that's my flat 7, right? Like I said, it's not the most conventional thing, but it sounds super cool because it's not conventional, right? So that's what I'm doing there. And then I'm literally grabbing the pickup here, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and right? Now what I'm doing is flat 7, and now I'm grabbing the 9 of the G chord. Now the thing is, in the key of F, this is a secondary dominant, this is a 2 major chord, right? So if it was completely diatonic, meaning coming from the major scale in terms of chords, it would be a G minor, but it's not, right? It's a dominant 7th, right? But the 9 works in that, right? And if anybody has a question about that, and like kind of an easy way to sort of compartmentalize chord changes in harmony, you can ask me for the question part, because that's a really good question. So keep that in mind. But right, we have flat 7, 9 for the G7. But what's important, right? See, you know, remember the roots, the thirds, the fifths, and the sevenths. That's the foundation for your house, right? It's you know, it's holding up the walls, the way you paint it, whatever. Those are all the color tones, the 9s, the 11th, 13, the flat 9, the sharp 11, the flat 13, you know, all that kind of stuff. But because these are building blocks, a flat 7, it's just such a strong note in our head, right? That it works fantastically. If fantastically is a word, right? So we have that's all D7, right? 4 bars of that. Pick up on and a 4. Flat 7 and 9 for G7. Ba-boom, ba-boom, boom. Da-dum, da-boom, boom. Same rhythm. Keep that nice strong motif going. All right, now we're on C7. So pretty much what I do is I look at this arpeggio and I shift it down a whole step, right? So we're literally, here's the chord we played. There's your second C7 with the gateway, right? This whole area right here to this one. So our arpeggio is right, and I'm doing the exact same thing I did up a whole step, down a whole step. So we have 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2. Right? So that covers those first 12 bars, right? So boom, 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 boom. Third to the fifth. Really just thirds and fifths, right? Chord tones work. Cool rhythms, remember. Now the flat 7 to the 9 of the G chord, G7. C7, and I'll play with the track here in a second so it makes sense. Now we go to F, right? So we're kind of getting over finishing the first half of the tunes. Then we have F. How did I see F? I saw it just like that, right? I'm keeping it in the same area. I know C7 is here. I know this F is right underneath. Easy grab, right? Right, so we go 1, 2, 3, 4. Give it a break, right? It's a little notey anyways. It's always nice space, remember? Any good solo melody that should kind of have arcs like that, you know? Shouldn't just be, you know, up and down. And then I just literally short eighth notes arpeggiate. Root, third, seventh, so there's our arpeggio. It's coming straight out of that, right? If you're feeling adventurous, which I always recommend to be adventurous because you can see everything, right? Third, fifth, root again. Right, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and now we hit. We're at that split bar right before it turns around again, right, to the second half of the tune. So we have and 2 and 3 and 4, and I went back to the fifth, 1, 2, and then I hit the C sharp because there's our A7, right? And we need to let the listener know, oh, there's a different chord change there, right? So you just move up a half step for that, and then we get to the second part, which is actually a really fun lick that I'm going to show you in a second. But so all together we have I'll play it with the tune here in a second, but we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and G7. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Right? Kind of has a cool blues feel in a way. F chord, right? Boom, 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 boom. And then 2, 3. I just slide down with my pinky right there. 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Right? And now we're at the second half. So I'll play that with the track real quick. Right? Here we go. Slide, right? Now our second half, right? So we got a cool motif going. We're in a lower range on the guitar. We've got short notes, right? Pretty much, I'm not the best person to talk about right hand technique. I kind of have weird technique, if you ever noticed. I kind of fan my hand. And then I tend to, a lot of it's alternate picking. Sometimes I tend to use a downstroke when I switch strings, right? So. It's pretty much alternate. But every time I do it down on beat 1, right? I use a downstroke. And then, right? Okay, so now we're on to the second part. So if that's all making sense, what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep expanding upon this. So here's our second kind of motif, right? Now remember, these kinds of things also, like I mentioned, they work great if you're playing at blazing speeds. And another thing, I had a great teacher. He kind of taught me, you know, I remember like playing gypsy jazz and stuff like super fast. I said, how do you keep up with that? And that was the power. He said, man, if you can come up with one cool little lick that's easy on your fingers like this, you know, and then just know when your chord changes, oh, if I can just switch one note or something and just do the math on the other notes. So remember, that's, you know, easier said than done, but super powerful tool, because when you're going by that fast too, right? It gives the listener, it's like, oh, cool. He's like building something. It's not just like, you know, a bunch of stuff everywhere, right? He's making a statement, you know, and it sounds super cool. Okay, so second half here, right? Just looking at my notes. Now what we're doing, this is a really fun lick. We're gonna use thirds, just thirds, and sevenths, right? Okay, so here's how I'm looking at this, right? Now remember, you wanna see everything, but if you're kind of looking from these two arpeggios like we already are, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the third, right? The second half goes. Little Inspector Gadget, right? And that's our second half. So this is an F sharp note, my friends, right? I'm looking at it from there, I see it from here, same arpeggio group, right? And what I'm doing is, I love this, right? So there's my F sharp, that is the third of the D7th chord, right? And what I'm doing, and what you're gonna do is you're gonna use your first and your pinky for this, right? And everything's marked correctly, so you just look at the supplemental material if you need to look at it again. We have an F sharp there. We have an F sharp there on the third. A little odd tune there. That's a little better. Right, F sharp, second string, 7th fret, first finger. And then what I do is I grab the other F sharp on the 11th fret with my pinky on the 3rd string. Now the thing is this is a kind of syncopated rhythm. That sometimes is the hardest. With rhythms, everyone too, a good trick, especially if you find them hard to read, just try to get them in your head. That helps a ton. And it just makes things a little bit more manageable because this is kind of a, like I said, sort of a syncopated thing. But what we have here, right, if you're looking at bar, was that 618? Right, so the top of the second page, this is it, right? And on the 3rd string, those notes are always going to be short, right? And I'm pretty much just alternate picking. Actually, so I'm picking up on the 1st. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and it's up down every time. Then down, you know, then alternate there. So. Right, so F sharp to F sharp, right? It's just such a cool sound. Super jazzy, right? Not maybe like the most conventional thing. We're kind of, like I said, thinking a little left to center with some of this stuff today, but it sounds super hip, right? So we got, you know, and I'm kind of pushing on and off. And, you know, I meant to say that earlier with chords, same thing. You'll notice I kind of, and we've talked about this a bunch in here, but you notice like my fingers dance, if you will, right? I put pressure and then I let it go. And what that does is it chokes the note where it's not. See what I'm saying? It needs to be nice and short and bouncy, swingy, right? So you kind of choke them there, right? Same with this. So it kind of maybe looks a little harder to see, but that keeps them nice and short rather than, right? And it's an octave, that's all it is, just with 2 strings, but it just sounds super cool on guitar. So what we're doing is we have the 3rd of the D7th. And then move down a half step. And what note is that? That's an F, right? So essentially, same thing, but just with 2 strings. See, it's so much more effective than just doing 1 note, right? Because you get a different tone because you're on a different string. Right? And then move down a half step. And then there's your G note, right? Or sorry, the F note. And what is that? That's the flat 7 of the G chord. Right? D7 to G7 like that, right? So what you're doing is like I said, because of the phenomenon of the fourths harmonically, you're just moving down 1 half step. So it's almost like it's completely correct because you're dealing with a 3rd and a 7th, the 3rd of the D7, the 7th of the dominant 7th note, a whole step away from the root on the G7. But super hip sound. Same exact thing, just keep that syncopated rhythm, get that motif in everybody's head. Right? And now we're on to D minor to A7. So how am I seeing that? I'm straight up looking at 5th position D minor arpeggio right under there. A great, right? I'm really just playing the roots, 3rds, and 5ths. You can do 7s if you want. But, for arpeggios too, all intents and purposes, like, just as long as you can get that, you just want to be able to see that area, like I said. So it's not just some area you play a melody when Austin teaches you Sweet Georgia Bright, right? Don't do that. Look at the arpeggios. So there's that. And then what we're doing is we're just walking up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? And then I'm using kind of the rhythm of Inspector Gadget, right? Short, right? So boom, 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 A7 here, there's the 5th of A7, and then like we grabbed earlier on the first half, there's your C sharp again for the A7. So the 5th to the 3rd, so we have 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and then boom, 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 same thing, then all the way up to the D. 1, and 2, and 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, 4. Work back, so I mean, it's literally, we got the Inspector Gadget going, but I was able to slide back. Why? Because there's our C sharp up an octave for the A7th again, right? So we have 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. Now we're gonna close it out, right? I've been playing this lick for years. Works great. It's literally just cycling arpeggios. So for the turnaround, when we go F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C, F, right? I slide in. Now remember, all these motifs, a lot of these we're catching on the end of 4, right? We're kind of keeping everything contained like that, right? It's like a good musical solo idea, right? Could also work great in a melody. Like I said, a little bit different today. But, you know, if you keep all that rather than just kind of being all over the place, some structure there, it makes for a great statement, right? So then we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And now what we do is we jump up to the lower area of the neck again. We have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. Short again. 1 and 2. And then what I do is I take this arpeggio and I slide it back a half step, and then I go 3 and 4, and then I slide it down again to grab the E flat, 1 and 2, now D, but backwards, right? D flat, and then what I do, you could just go open, but then you have that ringing G string. So what I do is I just grab my C arpeggio from like this shape. That's how I see it. And then I go boom, boom, boom. 5, 3, 1. F, 2, 3, 4. F, E, because the A7, and then we're back to D. And then I just landed there, and then you have the whole other form to practice either this or practice soloing or, you know, or whatever. Rhythm, second line, all that kind of stuff, right? Do it all, trust me. So one more time right there, we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4. Now here's how I pick this too. Downstroke on every string. Down, 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 up, down, down, right? Yep, down, 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 up, down, 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 down. Then I do down, up, down. So, down, 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 up, down. I'm confusing myself now. Yeah, down, 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 up, down, 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 up, down, 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 up, down. Right, and that's our second half. Here, I'll play that again, and then we can recap here. All right, so here's our second half. F, right? Whoops, back up 1 sec. F, F2, 3, 4, F, then to the A. Then we have nice and short. Right? And who said arpeggios aren't cool, right? Yeah, so that's what's going on today, right? So we'll play through it one more time, and then we'll recap. But remember, right, we got our chords. You can use any of those shapes anywhere, right? What's important, that cage system is always helpful. This is, remember, I say this every week, but this is a puzzle piece. If you learn that, all your shapes, the 5 shapes, the important ones, it'll totally help you see the fretboard much better, right? So our first part, right, kind of coming from these 2 arpeggios, right, and then from G here, kind of seeing that, right, the 16th inversion of a G7 like that, then our C7 like that, right, just a C, but you know, right to F there, A7, and then back, seeing from the same arpeggio area, right? All right, here we go. From the top. 2, 3, 4. G. C. F. Right? D. E minor. Right? And there we have it, right? So 2 thirds and 7ths, right? So much you can do. Cool rhythm. Keep the idea of the motif happening. And you can make super cool music. And, you know, another thing, I didn't even get lower, but, like, you know, with D, you know, you can do super, you know, arpeggios are just so cool, and especially on the lower register, like 3rd, 5th, 7th. That's just straight from G right there, right? But that was the same thing, just, you know, I'm doing a 3rd, 5th, flat 7 of the C, right? Just on the lower register. So remember just to kind of check that out. It's a super hip area of the neck. It's super useful. Everybody's always on the top strings, but why not use the lower strings, right? Okay, cool. So yeah, let's open it up for some questions today. Thanks everybody. I hope that was useful. Like I said, just the motif. Keep looking at all your arpeggios. Now remember too, just, you know, these are all separate lessons, right? But, you know, you can always use rhythmic displacement with this, right? You could slip in, you know, like on some of these tunes where we were like maybe adding a little spice or like a little lead line between the melody, you know, with like a pentatonic or whatever. You know, I really encourage everybody just to fill up their arsenal with all these things, you know, make little notes of it. Like, you know, you have the whole second half of this tune, so you could take it and be like, all right, now I'm going to maybe incorporate something from lesson 3 or lesson 5 or whatever, you know, and the more that you kind of use all of it, you know, you, like I said, you just have more tools in the toolbox. So, all right, thank you everybody. Let's open it up for some questions, and then I'll see you next week. All right, thanks. Hello everybody, I hope you enjoyed week 9 of creating jazz melodies. So let's get to some questions here. All right, Holland Boots. I like your handle, Holland Boots. I think I've said that before. Holland Boots asks, I've always wondered, where does New Orleans second line music fall within the scope of jazz history? That's a good question. So second line, what is it? I think it was a magazine. What was it? New Orleans Jazz, like in the 50s. Sort of coined it, but the idea behind second line, right? Like music is such a big history of New Orleans. So with the jazz funeral, right? It's like you'd have the band, the family, and then the, you know, not the immediate family, but the extended family. and friends, and they would always march in 2 lines behind the band. So that's kind of how second line happened. And then it's also a big tradition, obviously, with, you know, New Orleans and, like, you know, all the history, the voodoo stuff. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, you know, the celebration of life and death, all that kind of stuff, right? So also too with weddings, it's same thing, right? You know, band, and then you have the family, and then the second line, which would be the, you know, extended family and friends. So that's kind of, from what I understand, is kind of how that comes from. And obviously with jazz, you know, I mean, arguably, well, I guess, you know, jazz, you know, 2 big hotspots way back in the day were Kansas City and New Orleans, right? And jazz is a melting pot for music. So that's sort of why, like, you know, with the 3/2 clave and stuff, you know, it's rhythms from, you know, African music in various parts of the world. So that's sort of, you know, when I explained the 3/2 clave in the beginning, why, how that works, you know, just with more the grace notes on the snare and stuff, and that kind of flavor. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. We got Steve. What's up, Steve? We got Steve. I was reading an article the other day and came across the phrase modal interchange. What is that? So modal interchange, based on the way I understand that, and forgive me, I don't really use that term very much. And you got to remember, with music, a lot of times there's, you know, there's a little, you know, there's a lot of nomenclature, right? It's one way to describe things, but there's a million different ways to do it. Like, I always kind of think about it, you know, if you think about, like, the English language, you know, I'm hungry, I'm starving, you know, like, there's multiple ways to say certain things. So sometimes with music that can be confusing, especially, like, I feel like I've gotten this question in here before. I've definitely got it in the live chats and stuff, the Q&A sessions before. But like with naming upper extensions, like, people will ask me, well, why do you call it 9, 11, and 13 rather than 2, 4, and 6, right? Because 1, 3, 5, and 7 are the bones of chord, the root, the third, the fifth, seventh, and then in between, right? So there's different ways to sort of think about that. So I guess what I'm saying, you know, or why you would name 2, 4, and 6, 11, or 9, 11, and 13. Usually meaning there's some sort of seventh, and then if there's a seventh in that chord, 2 becomes 9, 4 becomes 11, and then 6 becomes 13. But with modal interchange, like I said, it might mean different things to people. I'm just kind of putting that out there. But what I would think, kind of like when we did last week with Coltrane's impressions a la expressions, right? We kind of talked about the Dorian mode, but modal interchange I would think would be the same thing, where it's like you take, you know, if you're on a 1-chord jam, right, you can start like by playing Mixolydian, which is just a major scale with a flat 7, right? And then say you wanted to switch it to Phrygian and stuff. And like a couple weeks ago, if you checked that lesson out, if you haven't, it's worth checking out, because I do describe some of this stuff. But the same idea, where it's like, you know, if you're in a stagnant jam like that, you can kind of start playing different modes. And what that does is it gives, you know, oh, that's what I was saying. Like, you know, a good example would be like Medeski, Martin, and Wood with John Scofield. Like, you know, if you ever listen to that record, like a Go-Go, or, you know, some of that other stuff, where they like sort of jam on one chord. And especially if you see it live, I mean, it happens in like the jam band world too, and like the festival scene, but they'll have these long jams, right? And it's like, oh, but it kind of goes through a journey. And that's when you're changing, you know, modes. And like last week, I used the example of pedaling, you know, from D to C with the bass note. That kind of implies, oh, Dorian. But, you know, say it started going D to, you know, to E flat. You know, you can start using different, like a Phrygian type mode, right? So, you know, that would be what I would kind of consider modal interchange, where there's, you know, you're like I said, keeping things interesting by switching modes. So, cool. All right, it looks like that's all we have today. Everybody stay tuned next week. It's going to be a good one. We're going to talk about the 4 minor chord, the Wild Child. And we're going to do some cool stuff with that. We're even going to go a little further and superimpose a 4 minor over a 5 chord. So that's going to be fun. So yeah, thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed that, that lesson, and stay tuned for next week. All right, thank you.